welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at the next part of Epic History TV's Napoleonic War series. This one is about Spain, 1809 to 1811. This war was my downfall. Yes, that's a succinct analysis by Napoleon. It certainly was one of the main contributing factors to Napoleon's defeat. It was not the only one, but this war was futile from the onset. And if you know anything about Napoleon, it is that he has completely embraced the sunk fallacy concept, which means that once he had started something, he would not end until he was finished. And as would be the case in this war, it would never be finished, or at least not on his terms.
In 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was at the height of his power. He had just won another crushing victory against Austria at Wagram and imposed a humiliating peace treaty. But the war he'd started in Spain and Portugal, with his ill-judged invasion the previous year, continued to rage. Napoleon had placed his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, uniting a proud country against him. His troops had dealt ruthlessly with popular uprisings, while routing a succession of Spanish armies. In February 1809, Marshal Lannes overcame the heroic defense of Zaragoza in a brutal siege that cost 54,000 Spanish lives and 10,000 French.
Yes, the French had committed 2 whole army corps to the siege, about 45,000 men, and the Spanish garrison was about equal size. General Palafox's vigorous defense of the city brought Zaragoza enduring national and international fame by withstanding a lengthy combination of disease, starvation, and constant attacks by French forces. Though Marshal Lannes, who was in charge of this siege, managed to methodically break down Spanish defenses and eventually overcame it at a high cost.
But still, the Spanish and Portuguese remained defiant. And 3 months after their escape from Coruña, the British were back. In April, Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Lisbon to lead a small Anglo-Portuguese army. British redcoats would fight alongside Portuguese troops, who, with the help of British training, would soon prove themselves highly effective.
Yes, in addition to being appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in Iberia, Wellington, or Arthur Wellesley as it's called by now, is also appointed the Commander-in-Chief of the Portuguese Army by the Portuguese government. And this allowed the British to equip, train, and reorganize Portuguese militias into an effective fighting force that soon would prove themselves invaluable to Wellington. I'm going to refer to him as Wellington. Wellington's future campaigns on the Iberian Peninsula. And they would make up a substantial part of the army and be involved in all major campaigns and engagements across this very lengthy war.
3 weeks after arriving in Portugal, Wellesley moved against Marshal Soult's 2nd Corps, which had recently taken Porto. Soult and his troops, preoccupied with plundering the region, had no warning of the British advance, and were soon in headlong retreat, back through the mountains into Spain.
Spain is a country where small armies are defeated and large armies starve. That's a very accurate statement, but the point is that if you have a small army, you have no chance of beating a country that is so massive that Spain is. And if you bring a large army, well, don't expect any help with supplies and logistics through the mountainous terrains. Fun fact, Henry IV was the King of France from the House of Bourbon. He was actually the first king of the House of Bourbon, which itself was a cadet branch of the old Capetian dynasty in France. He famously issued the Edict of Nantes in 1589, which granted Protestants in France religious liberty, effectively ending the very destructive French wars of religion. Now, that's just a side tangent.
Having secured Portugal for the time being, Wellesley planned a joint campaign with General Cuesta, commanding the Spanish army of Extremadura. On the 10th of July, the two commanders met at Casas de Miravete to discuss strategy. Relations between these two allies were not straightforward. Spain and Britain had a long history of conflict. The Spanish were deeply suspicious of British intentions in Spain, while the British had a low opinion of the Spanish army, which they considered poorly trained and badly led.
Yes, Anglo-Spanish relations had been marked by numerous wars and conflicts over the centuries, starting from probably the 14th century. Many of these conflicts have sparked as a result of Britain's long-standing alliance with Portugal, and this has led to an overall strained relationship marked by deep mistrust on both sides, like they just said. And the various Anglo-Spanish wars, including the one where the Spanish Armada attempted to topple Elizabeth I, the 7 Years' Wars, the War of the Spanish Succession, the American Revolutionary Wars, the French Revolutionary Wars. These are just some of examples of conflicts in which England/Britain and Spain had been on opposite sides. And this conflict continues today to some extent, though it's not nearly as serious, but there is still a dispute over the territory of Gibraltar, which the British still claim and hold, despite Spanish objections.
Wellesley's request to take over command of Spanish forces was rejected, but the generals agreed to a joint advance up the Tagus Valley towards Madrid, to be supported by General Venegas, advancing from La Mancha. In the face of their advance, Marshal Victor's First Corps withdrew to Talavera, where he was joined by King Joseph and General Sebastiani's Fourth Corps. The French plan was for Joseph's army to defend Madrid, while Marshal Soult led 3 corps down from the north to get behind and trap the Anglo-Spanish forces. But Joseph, worried by Soult's slow progress and General Venegas's advance on Madrid, decided to attack at Talavera.
"30,000 British troops some 150 leagues from the sea against 100,000 of the best troops in the world. My God." Yeah, this is a comment by Napoleon that really shows the stubbornness of the British army in Iberia, which refused to be driven out by the far numerically superior French.
The Battle of Talavera saw British infantry bear the brunt of the French assault. They stood firm and repelled the enemy with disciplined musket fire and bayonet charges. Talavera was a small battle compared to the great clashes fought that year in Austria, but it proved that under Wellesley, Britain's small, well-drilled army was a force to be reckoned with, even though in the short term, victory achieved little. Warned of Soult's approach from captured dispatches, the victorious Anglo-Spanish army retreated, while King Joseph and Fourth Corps marched against Venegas's army, which they smashed at the Battle of Almonacid.
Yes, if the French had trouble defeating Wellington and his Anglo-Portuguese army, they never had any trouble whatsoever in defeating Spanish regular forces. They were just too badly led, too badly organized and drilled. It was never a contest against Napoleon's professional army, even though As the war went on, the Iberian French forces consisted mostly of rather young conscripts.
That autumn, the Supreme Junta in Seville, Free Spain's effective government, raised 2 new armies for another attempt to liberate Madrid.
Yes, with the old royal government and administration toppled, and with the new French administration being quite uniformly rejected across the board by the Spanish population, several local governments had formed so-called juntas as a patriotic alternative to King Joseph's government. This, however, led to more confusion as there was no central authority who could speak on behalf of all of Spain, and they realized they needed unity in order to, 1, cooperate with the British, and 2, to defeat the French. And as a result, a central supreme junta was formed, which became the institution that accumulated the legislative and executive powers of Free Spain. And it was composed of a mix of prominent members of society that represented all the various regions of Spain. Many of the members were active or retired army officers. But the junta proved to be quite incompetent, at least the initial junta, which we will see shortly here, where several Spanish armies are defeated soundly by the French.
Planning to converge on the capital from north and south. But Wellesley, ennobled as Viscount Wellington for his victory at Talavera, had been so disgusted by the lack of Spanish cooperation that summer that he refused to risk his army. Predictably, Spain's inexperienced armies met with disaster. At Ocaña, they suffered their biggest defeat of the war, when a smaller force under Marshal Soult routed the Spanish army, taking 14,000 prisoners and 50 cannon. A week later, the army of the left was heavily defeated at Alba de Tormes. There was more bad news when Girona fell to the French after an epic 7-month siege.
Yes, although badly outnumbered, the Spanish defenders at Girona held off a French force of 32,000 men for a very long time, and the French again suffered heavy casualties until the defenders were finally compelled to surrender due to the threat of starvation and disease. This was an important victory for the French because Girona was strategically located on the main road between France and Spain. So this was important in order to secure French logistics in the future operations in Iberia.
The Supreme Junta's plans to retake Madrid were in tatters, and southern Spain was now wide open to French attack.
My object is not to obtain submission by force, but to dispel illusions. I will arrive at a union of hearts. Yes, King Joseph, he really tried his best at trying to institute some form of functional government, but in reality, his authority stretched. It didn't stretch beyond the city of Madrid itself, because the rest of the rest of Spain rather, was either under French military occupation administration, or it was not in French hands at all. And Joseph, he tried to learn Spanish, he tried to embrace Catholicism, push for some much needed progressive reforms, but in reality, it didn't come to much in the end.
In January 1810, King Joseph marched south with an army of 60,000 men. Spanish resistance evaporated. Spain's Supreme Junta was overthrown in a coup.
The Supreme Junta, as we just talked about, was, yes, temporarily dissolved, but they would be back and reconstituted at Cadiz. Now, it should be mentioned that the Supreme Junta was by no means a democratically elected assembly. Like I said, was made out of prominent members of society sent by the various regions of Spain.
As Cordova and Seville fell without a fight, Joseph, who still hoped to win over the Spanish with his progressive reforms, was welcomed by many as a savior from anarchy. Only Cadiz held out, its defences reinforced by a British naval squadron, and was besieged by Victor's First Corps. Meanwhile, Napoleon sent Marshal Massena to Spain with 65,000 reinforcements. He was reckoned one of Napoleon's best marshals, and had just been made Prince of Essling for his heroics in the recent war against Austria. Massena was to lead a third French invasion of Portugal, take Lisbon and chase the British back into the sea. He laid siege to Ciudad Rodrigo, a fortified city controlling one of the main routes into Portugal, which surrendered after 2 weeks' bombardment. Wellington, with only 33,000 men to face Massena's 50,000, retreated. Massena crossed the Portuguese frontier and besieged Almeida. After just 13 hours of bombardment, a lucky French shot hit the Portuguese magazine. 70 tons of gunpowder went up in a devastating explosion that made all further resistance useless.
Yes, that was indeed a lucky shot, because a siege such as that could drag on for at least a few weeks, if not months.
It was a serious blow to Wellington, who'd been relying on Almeida's strong defences to buy him time. At Busaco, he found a strong defensive position and made a stand. Massena's uphill frontal attack failed, at a cost of 4,000 casualties. But the next day, the French found a way to outflank Wellington's position, and his retreat continued. As Massena's army neared Lisbon, his scouts reported something completely unexpected. Stretching across the Lisbon Peninsula, protecting the city from attack, they found a new chain of fortifications in 2 major lines. Known as the Lines of Torres Vedras, the British and Portuguese had been constructing these defences for more than a year. Now the lines bristled with more than 100 forts, redoubts and batteries, manned by 30,000 troops and 250 guns.
Yes, if you know anything about Lord Wellington, it is the fact that he was a master of defensive warfare. That's what he's most famous for, I would argue, though he was not bad on the offense by any means. However, this was a very brilliant defensive network that effectively killed all hopes of the French conquering Lisbon. And if you don't have Lisbon, you cannot control Portugal.
Massena soon discovered the lines were far too strong for him to attack. What's more, a scorched earth strategy had stripped the surrounding countryside of anything that might help the French. While Portuguese partisans attacked French supply columns as they struggled through the mountains to reach Massena's army. Massena faced a grim predicament. Starved of supplies, too weak to attack, unwilling to retreat. But throughout this standoff, it was Portuguese peasants who suffered most of all. When their villages and farms were burned, many took refuge in Lisbon, where thousands died of starvation and disease.
As always in warfare, it is the civilian population who suffers the most. And we do not have to go far back in history. We don't have to go back in history at all. There is a conflict in Ukraine going on right now in which the civilian population has suffered terribly. So, yeah, that's always something to remember when we're discussing these wars and battles. There are always people getting caught in the crossfire. "So, Prince of Essling, you are no longer Massena, Napoleon to Marshal Massena." That is a devastating quote. It basically means that Marshal Massena, who after his heroics in the 1809 campaign against Austria had received the title Prince of Essling, which was a victory title, not a title that came with any sort of land or anything like that. But anyways, it meant that he was no longer the Massena of old.
Back in France, Napoleon had been preoccupied with his divorce from the Empress Josephine.
A few years after Josephine's coronation as Empress of the French, it became clear that she could not have any more children, which prompted Napoleon to begin thinking about divorcing her in order to secure his line of succession. When Napoleon's nephew, the son of Louis Bonaparte and Hortense de Beauharnais, Josephine's daughter, died in 1807, the divorce sort of became inevitable. In late November 1809, Napoleon informed Josephine of his decision to divorce her in the interests of France, as he called it. And Josephine agreed without much fuss, though she was not happy about it, of course. But despite this divorce, it is clear that both Josephine and Napoleon still loved each other despite the many ups and downs in their long, complicated relationship, because she recognized that Napoleon needed an heir, not only to secure his line of succession, but to bring stability to the new dynasty. And Napoleon allowed her to retain the title of Empress, and she was given a large yearly stipend for her expenses. So it was not like she was exiled or anything.
And then a new marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of the Emperor of Austria. She was now expecting their first child.
We will get back to Marie-Louise in a future video, I believe. So we can talk a bit more about her then.
Nevertheless, from Paris, Napoleon sent frequent orders to his marshals in Spain and Portugal, urging them to take more aggressive action. But when these orders arrived weeks later, they were usually out of date and showed little understanding of the problems his marshals faced. He now ordered Soult, based in Andalusia.
This is really a shame, because the French really could have used a unifying and centralizing figure like the Emperor himself coming in person to take over command of French forces. I think that was the only way the French was going to get out of this conflict in somewhat of a victorious state. And even with Napoleon's personal direct intervention, I'm not so sure that he could have successfully concluded this war.
To go on the offensive to draw enemy forces away from Lisbon, so Massena could take the city. Soult laid siege to Badajoz, a fortified city that controlled the southern route into Portugal. When 12,000 men of the army of Extremadura marched to its relief, they were routed by Soult, after which the city tamely surrendered, giving up 8,000 prisoners and vast quantities of stores. It was another heavy blow to Spain's armed forces. But remarkably, despite such disasters and their many blundering generals, the Spanish troops remained willing to fight, the courage of the rank and file undimmed.
And that's one of the winning factors for the Spanish in this war. The fact that the population continued year after year to resist French occupying rule. And, you know, if you have a population that is so intent on driving you out, I don't see how, even if you win military victories, or win on a military plane, you cannot ultimately win the war if you do not bring the people over to your side. And it was never going to happen in this case.
Victor's First Corps, besieging Cadiz, had now been so weakened to support other operations that the Anglo-Spanish garrison decided to attack. The Allies landed along the coast to strike at the French siege lines from the rear. but they were ambushed by the French at Barossa. Despite heavy losses, the Anglo-Portuguese rearguard fought off the enemy, but a furious falling out between British commander Sir Thomas Graham and his Spanish counterpart General La Peña threw away any advantage.
Typical.
Soult, alarmed at these developments, marched back to Andalusia. Meanwhile, Massena, out of food and with no prospect of reinforcement, had no option but to retreat. Wellington's army pursued, discovering evidence of several appalling atrocities committed by the French against Portuguese villagers. There were running battles with the French rearguard, brilliantly commanded by Marshal Ney, until he was sacked by Massena for criticizing his leadership.
Also typical.
Having chased the French out of Portugal, Wellington besieged Almeida. Massena's army, now rested and reinforced, marched to its aid. The two armies clashed again at Fuentes de Oñoro. In 2 days of heavy fighting, Massena failed to break through Wellington's position to relieve Almeida. The fortress fell the next week, but to Wellington's fury, British bungling allowed most of the French garrison to escape. Massena had lost 25,000 men in Portugal. Now he'd lost Almeida too, and a string of bad decisions, not least to bring his mistress with him on campaign, had cost him the respect of his officers. The Marshal, whom Napoleon had once nicknamed the Dear Child of Victory, was recalled to France in disgrace, never to hold senior command again.
And in Massena's defense, he had expressed his unwillingness to go on this campaign even before he was given the orders officially. And despite this, Napoleon sent him because Marshal Massena had been fighting under Napoleon's leadership since the Italian campaigns in 1796 and had served him well in all of his campaigns during the Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars, and who was one of the few marshals that could be trusted with a large independent command. And he achieved much fame and greatness during all of these wars, and he proved himself an extremely capable commander. However, at this time, Marshal Massena was clearly close to retirement, so to speak. Actually, he should probably retired years ago if it were not for the fact that Napoleon desperately required his services. So, after this, he was basically done. The campaign destroyed his reputation, and he was basically shattered as a military commander.
Napoleon sent Marshal Marmont to replace him. Meanwhile, Marshal Beresford, the British commander of Portugal's army, was sent to retake Badajoz with 20,000 British and Portuguese troops. When Soult approached with a relief force, Beresford marched to meet him at Albuera. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Around 6,000 casualties on each side, with more than a third of the British infantry killed, wounded or captured. Marshal Soult declared,
"There is no beating these troops, in spite of their generals. I always thought they were bad soldiers. Now I'm sure of it. I had turned their right, pierced their center, and everywhere victory was mine. But they didn't know how to run."
I think this is the only time Epic History TV used this sort of narration for the quotes, and I don't think it was that great.
Soult had been checked, but he was determined to save Badajoz. The newly arrived Marshal Marmont marched to his aid, and they advanced again. This combined army forced the British to abandon the siege. But when Wellington withdrew to a strong defensive position across the Portuguese border, Soult and Marmont did not pursue. French commanders in Spain had learned grudging respect for Wellington and for the steadiness of his troops. For now, the war in Spain had entered stalemate.
Spain. General's fortune. Officer's ruin. Soldier's death. French barracks graffiti. Pretty accurate, actually.
While British, French and Spanish armies crisscrossed Spain and Portugal, another war was fought every day in the mountains, hills and woods. From 1808, Spanish and Portuguese civilians, militias and ex-soldiers began taking up arms against the hated French invader. They waged a war of ambushes and hit-and-run raids, known in Spanish as La Guerrilla, the Little War. Its fighters became known in English as guerrillas. Britain's Royal Navy supplied vital weapons, stores and money, often landing them behind enemy lines. Much of Spain's rugged countryside fell under the control of the guerrillas.
The Peninsular War is generally regarded as one of the first true people's wars due to the emergence of this large-scale guerrilla warfare. And this would prove a constant menace for the French forces, and it would play a large part in the French downfall in this conflict. Now, it's important to remember that the guerrillas, while being effective against the French, were also terrorizing their own countrymen with forced conscriptions, requisitions, and even looting at some points. But despite this, the guerrilla warfare proved the single most effective tactic for resisting French occupation, and they tied down large numbers of troops and supplies, which in turn facilitated Wellington's conventional victories. This war is a perfect example of how difficult it is to fight a popular insurgency with conventional means, because the French didn't really know how to handle this. They would, march with an army or units to stamp out these guerrillas like they would with any regular army, and that proved to be a highly ineffective way of dealing with it. And there are some examples, like Marshal Suchet in Aragon actually managed to win over some of the Spanish populace with a hearts of mind strategy, and that's probably a strategy that the rest of the French commanders should have pursued, but alas, it was not to be.
North of Madrid, Juan Martín Díez, an ex-soldier known as El Empecinado, the Stubborn, led a guerrilla band 6,000 strong. In Navarre, Esposi Mina, a former peasant, ran a highly organized band that caused havoc for the French, capturing convoys and couriers on the strategic Burgos-Bayonne road, and branding Viva Mina on the forehead of collaborators. While in the west, Julian Sanchez, known as El Charro, led the self-styled Lanceros de Castilla. El Charro himself wore a French hussar's cap, its eagle symbolically turned upside down. There were dozens more bands operating across Spain, though a few were no better than bandits, terrorizing civilians as often as the enemy. The guerrilla war was merciless, marked by hideous atrocities on both sides. A French soldier's greatest fear was to be taken alive by the guerrillas, who often tortured their prisoners before killing them. Tens of thousands of French troops were tied down by this people's war, guarding outposts or patrolling the countryside. The roads were so dangerous for French messengers that they required cavalry escorts of 200 men or more. Many still didn't get through, their valuable dispatches forwarded to Wellington, for whom they became an invaluable source of intelligence.
I think people often underestimate the value that intelligence played even in older warfare. We often think of intelligence as a crucial part of modern warfare, but Intelligence gathering has always been a key part of any military campaign, and these dispatches proved extremely valuable to Wellington, being able to predict where and when the French would strike, where they have their supplies, where they have their men, and so on.
The war in Spain would ultimately cost the lives of 240,000 French soldiers. As was typical in wars of this era, most died from disease. But more died fighting guerrillas than in battle against the British and Spanish armies.
Yes, I've seen some new figures on this that may dispute this, but it's true that most of these troops died of sickness or other causes.
However, it was the twin threat, a well-led regular army under Wellington and a popular insurgency, that left the French facing an impossible strategic dilemma. If their armies remained dispersed to fight the guerrillas, Wellington could attack. But if they concentrated to defeat Wellington in battle, huge swathes of the country would quickly fall to the guerrillas. This was Napoleon's Vietnam, or his bleeding ulcer, as he called it. A war that cost his empire an average of 100 casualties every day, with little prospect of victory. And in 1812, as Napoleon launched his gigantic invasion of Russia, Wellington and the guerrillas launched their own offensive that would turn the war in Spain on its head. Thank you.
Alright, that's Spain 1809-1811 covered. Next we're moving on to the Battle of Salamanca 1812. Then we're moving on to the Russian campaign, which is a disaster in and of itself. But yes, thank you for watching the video, and if you have anything to add, some context, please leave a comment and like the video if you liked it, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.